The year was 1415, and across the muddy fields of northern France, two armies faced each other in what would become the most shocking military upset in medieval history. On one side stood the flower of French nobility, thousands of heavily armored knights gleaming in steel, confident in their overwhelming numbers and centuries of military tradition. On the other side, a ragged band of English soldiers, exhausted from weeks of marching, decimated by disease, and outnumbered by odds that should have guaranteed their annihilation. What happened next would shatter the very foundations of medieval warfare, humble the mightiest kingdom in Europe, and transform a desperate English retreat into legend. This is the story of Agincourt, where mud, innovation, and sheer determination collided to create the most epic upset the medieval world had ever witnessed. To understand the magnitude of what occurred on that October morning, we must first journey back to the political powder keg that was early 15th century Europe. The stage for this extraordinary confrontation was set not by a single event, but by decades of simmering tensions, broken promises, and the relentless ambition of one young English king. England and France had been locked in the sprawling conflict known as the 100 Years' War for nearly 8 decades. This wasn't simply a dispute over territory or trade routes. At its heart lay fundamental questions about legitimate succession to the French crown and ownership of vast swaths of French soil. The English monarchy claimed not just pieces of France, but the throne itself, a claim that would drive Henry V to pursue one of the most audacious military campaigns in European history. The diplomatic breakdown that led to Agincourt began in the winter of 1414, when the English Parliament granted King Henry what was called a double subsidy, a tax levied at twice the traditional rate specifically to recover what Henry claimed was his rightful inheritance from France. The negotiations that followed were nothing short of extraordinary in their scope and ambition. Henry's demands read like a fantasy of conquest. He wanted the French to pay over 1.5 million crowns in outstanding ransom money dating back to a battle fought 60 years earlier. He demanded English ownership of Anjou, Brittany, Flanders, Normandy, Touraine, and Aquitaine, territories that would effectively recreate the medieval Angevin Empire. And as if that wasn't enough, he insisted on marrying Catherine, the daughter of the French king, with a dowry of 2 million crowns. The French response was predictably dismissive. They offered only marriage with Catherine, a dowry of 600,000 crowns, and a slightly enlarged Aquitaine. To Henry, this counteroffer was not just inadequate, it was insulting. English sources claimed that the French had mocked their proposals and ridiculed Henry himself. Whether this was diplomatic posturing or genuine contempt, the result was the same. By 1415, negotiations had completely collapsed, and Henry began preparing for war. The French found themselves in an impossible position, politically fractured and militarily unprepared for what was coming. King Charles VI, known to history as Charles the Mad, suffered from severe mental illness that left him unable to command the French army or provide coherent leadership. This created a power vacuum that French nobles filled with infighting and competing factions, exactly the kind of division that Henry planned to exploit. Into this chaos stepped one of medieval Europe's most formidable military leaders. Henry V was only 28 years old when he launched his invasion of France, but he had already established himself as a brilliant commander and charismatic monarch. Contemporary accounts describe him as stern, ruthless, and possessed of an extraordinary ability to inspire loyalty in his men. He was experienced beyond his years, having fought alongside his father at the Battle of Shrewsbury when he was barely out of his teens, and he possessed that rare combination of strategic brilliance, personal courage, and pragmatic ruthlessness that defines truly great military leaders. Henry was also deeply pious and well-educated, with a particular interest in liturgical music and a genuine concern for the welfare of his soldiers. His army was reportedly better behaved in France than many French soldiers themselves, as Henry intended to present himself as a more competent and just ruler than the mad French king. He famously hanged one of his own soldiers for stealing a pyx from a local church, demonstrating his commitment to maintaining discipline and winning the hearts and minds of the French people. On the 13th of August, 1415, Henry's invasion force landed on the Norman coast near the port city of Harfleur. The army numbered approximately 12,000 men, with up to 20,000 horses, a massive logistical undertaking that demonstrated English determination to achieve decisive results. Harfleur was strategically vital, controlling access to the Seine River and serving as a gateway to the heart of France. Henry knew that capturing it would provide a secure base for future operations and send a clear message that this campaign was no mere raid. But the siege of Harfleur proved far more costly than Henry had anticipated. What should have been a quick victory turned into a grinding, weeks-long ordeal that consumed precious time and resources. The French defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that their city's fall would open northern France to English conquest. Day after day, Henry's forces battered the walls with artillery and mining operations, while disease began to ravage the English camp. Dysentery struck with devastating effect, cutting through the ranks like an invisible enemy more deadly than French steel. Hundreds of soldiers fell ill, and many died in the fetid conditions of the siege lines. Others deserted, unwilling to continue what seemed like an increasingly hopeless enterprise. By the time Harfleur finally surrendered on September 22nd, Henry's proud army had been reduced from 12,000 to roughly 6,000 effective fighting men. With winter approaching and his force dangerously weakened, any sensible commander would have declared victory and returned to England with the valuable prize of Harfleur secured. Henry's advisors certainly counseled such a course, pointing out that he could easily return to Calais by sea without risking his remaining troops. But Henry V was not interested in playing it safe. Instead, he made a decision that seemed to border on madness. He announced his intention to march his depleted army across northern France to Calais, directly through territory controlled by French forces that vastly outnumbered his own. This wasn't a strategic necessity or a tactical maneuver. It was something far more dangerous, a calculated gamble designed to demonstrate English strength and French weakness. Henry assembled his war council and informed them of his decision, ignoring their obvious concerns about the foolhardiness of such a scheme. The march that began on October 8th would transform what should have been a routine withdrawal into a deadly gauntlet. Henry led his exhausted soldiers along the coast until French forces and destroyed bridges forced them far inland to find a crossing point over the Somme River. The French had systematically destroyed every bridge, heavily guarded the fords, and scorched the countryside to deny the invaders vital supplies. For days, the English struggled through hostile territory, constantly harassed by French scouts and growing weaker with each mile. They finally found a shallow crossing near Voyennes on October 19th, but by then it was clear that the French had assembled a massive army to intercept them. The trap was closing, and Henry's gamble was about to face its ultimate test. As the English approached the village of Agincourt on the evening of October 24th, they could see the campfires of the French host stretching across the horizon like fallen stars. Contemporary estimates vary wildly, but most sources agree that the French outnumbered the English by at least 3-1, with some accounts suggesting odds of 6-1 or even greater. The flower of French chivalry had gathered for what they assumed would be a glorious massacre. The French army that assembled near Agincourt represented the greatest concentration of military might that medieval Europe had ever witnessed. Noble banners fluttered in the autumn wind, each one representing centuries of martial tradition and feudal power. The Dukes of Orléans, Bourbon, and Alençon commanded forces that read like a roll call of European aristocracy. Count after count, lord after lord, they had answered the call to arms with enthusiasm, viewing this not as a desperate battle for survival, but as an opportunity for glory and easy victory against a weakened enemy. The French camp buzzed with confidence that bordered on arrogance. Knights polished their armor to mirror brightness, sharpened their weapons, and boasted loudly about the honors they would win and the ransoms they would collect. Many had already begun dividing up the spoils of victory, arguing over who would have the privilege of capturing the English king himself. The mood was almost festive, as if they were preparing for a tournament rather than a battle that would determine the fate of kingdoms. But while the French celebrated their anticipated triumph, a revolution in military technology was about to shatter their world forever. The weapon that would change everything stood 6 feet tall, carved from yew wood, and required years of training to master effectively. The English longbow was not merely an improvement over existing weapons, It was a complete transformation of battlefield dynamics that would render centuries of military tradition obsolete in a matter of hours. These were not the shorter, weaker bows that had been common throughout Europe for generations. The English longbow was a weapon of extraordinary power, requiring a draw weight of between 80 and 150 pounds. To put this in perspective, modern Olympic archers use bows with draw weights of approximately 48 pounds. The medieval English longbowman was pulling more than 3 times that force with each shot, sending heavy war arrows with enough velocity to penetrate all but the finest steel plate armor. The arrows themselves were works of deadly precision, measuring 37 inches long and tipped with bodkin points, designed specifically to punch through mail and plate. An experienced archer could loose 6 arrows per minute, meaning a force of several thousand bowmen could shower their enemies with tens of thousands of projectiles in just minutes. The effective range extended up to 350 yards, allowing English archers to begin killing French knights long before those knights could close to striking distance. What made the longbow truly revolutionary was not just its power, but the tactical flexibility it provided. Unlike the crossbow, which required time to reload between shots, or early firearms, which were slow and unreliable, the longbow could maintain a devastating rate of fire for extended periods. A skilled archer was a precision killing machine, capable of selecting targets, adjusting for range and wind, and delivering death with mechanical efficiency. The English had spent decades perfecting not just the weapon itself, but the tactics needed to employ it effectively. They had learned to deploy their archers on the flanks of their formations, protecting them with stakes driven into the ground to break up cavalry charges. They had discovered that dismounted men-at-arms in the center could hold enemy infantry, while the bowmen on the wings destroyed attacking cavalry. Most importantly, they had realized that choosing the right ground could multiply their advantages exponentially. As dawn broke on October 25th, the feast day of St. Crispin, Henry surveyed the battlefield with the eye of a master tactician. The terrain could not have been more perfect for his purposes. The field lay between 2 dense woods, creating a natural funnel that would prevent the French from using their superior numbers to outflank his position. The ground itself had been recently plowed, and several days of heavy rain had turned the rich Norman soil into a treacherous morass of sticky mud. Henry positioned his army with mathematical precision. His men-at-arms, perhaps 1,500 dismounted knights and heavily armored soldiers, formed the center of his line. These were his anchor, the immovable object that would absorb the initial French assault. On either flank, he deployed his archers in wedge formations that could pour converging fire into any force attempting to reach his center. The archers drove their protective stakes into the ground, creating a bristling barrier that would channel enemy cavalry into killing zones. Behind this careful arrangement lay tactical genius that would be studied by military theorists for centuries. Henry had taken every disadvantage his army faced and turned it into a strength. His smaller numbers meant greater mobility and easier command and control. His defensive position negated French numerical superiority while maximizing the effectiveness of his longbows. Most crucially, the muddy ground that made movement difficult for everyone would prove catastrophic for heavily armored French knights. The French, confident in their overwhelming advantage, had no such subtlety in their preparations. Their plan was brutally simple: charge across the field with their heavy cavalry, smash through the English line, and butcher the survivors. It was the same tactic that had dominated European battlefields for centuries, the irresistible force of mailed knights that had carved out kingdoms and toppled empires. They saw no reason why it should fail against a ragged band of English survivors. As the morning mist began to lift, both armies could see each other clearly for the first time. The contrast was stark and telling. The French host glittered like a jeweled serpent, thousands of knights in polished steel arranged in 3 massive divisions. Their banners snapped in the breeze, displaying the heraldry of the greatest families in France. Horses stamped and snorted, eager for the charge that would sweep away the English pretenders. The English line looked pitiful by comparison. Muddy, exhausted soldiers in worn leather and dented mail, many without proper helmets, standing behind a makeshift barrier of sharpened stakes. Their banners were few and battle-stained, their armor practical rather than decorative. To French eyes, they appeared to be exactly what they were: a defeated army waiting to die. But appearances, as the French were about to discover, could be devastatingly deceptive. Among those ragged ranks stood men who had trained with the longbow since childhood, whose shoulders and backs bore the distinctive deformities that came from a lifetime of drawing heavy warbows. These were not peasant militia hastily conscripted for a single campaign. They were professional soldiers who had honed their deadly craft through years of practice and previous battles. The psychological warfare had already begun. Henry moved among his troops, offering words of encouragement and demonstrating the calm confidence that marked great leaders in crisis. He reminded them of previous English victories, of the wealth that awaited those who survived, and most importantly, of the righteousness of their cause. These men were not just fighting for their king or their country, they were fighting for their lives, and that desperation would make them more dangerous than any French knight could imagine. The French commanders gathered in their silk pavilions that morning, their strategy sessions more resembling social gatherings than military councils. Duke Charles d'Orléans, barely 21 years old, spoke confidently of the honors he would win. The Duke of Bourbon adjusted his magnificent armor while discussing which English nobles he might capture for ransom. These were men who had never known defeat, whose entire worldview was built upon the unshakable belief that heavy cavalry was invincible and that French chivalry represented the pinnacle of military achievement. Their battle plan reflected this arrogance. The first wave would consist of mounted knights thundering across the field to shatter the English line through sheer impact. Behind them, a second wave of dismounted men-at-arms would finish off any survivors. Finally, a third wave of mounted reserves would pursue the fleeing remnants and complete the slaughter. It was a formation that had crushed armies across Europe for generations, and they saw no reason why a handful of sick Englishmen should prove any different. But as the French knights began their advance at 11 in the morning, the very ground beneath their horses' hooves began to betray them. The recent rains had transformed the freshly ploughed field into a nightmare of clinging mud that grabbed at every step. Horses that should have been galloping found themselves struggling through mire that reached their knees. Knights whose armor had been polished to mirror brightness were soon spattered with Norman soil that clung like cement. The English archers watched this stumbling advance with professional satisfaction. They had seen cavalry charges before, had studied the rhythm and timing needed to maximize their effectiveness. As the French horses labored closer, struggling through the treacherous footing, the archers drew their bowstrings to full extension and waited for the command that would unleash hell. When Henry's voice rang out across the English line, thousands of arrows rose into the grey October sky, like a dark cloud blotting out the Sunday. The sound was unlike anything the French had ever heard, a whistle and hiss that seemed to come from the very air itself. Then the arrows began to fall, and the killing commenced in earnest. The effect was catastrophic beyond anything the French could have imagined. Arrows punched through mail coifs and found gaps in plate armor with surgical precision. Horses screamed and fell, throwing their riders into the mud where they lay helpless under the weight of their own protection. Knights who had spent fortunes on the finest armor money could buy discovered that English bodkin points cared nothing for French craftsmanship. Those French knights who survived the initial volleys found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The mud that had slowed their advance now made retreat impossible. Wounded horses thrashed and rolled, crushing anyone unfortunate enough to fall beneath them. Men who had ridden to battle in formation now lay scattered across the field like broken toys, their magnificent armor transformed into steel coffins. But the longbow's devastating effectiveness was only beginning to unfold. As the first wave of French cavalry dissolved under the arrow storm, the archers simply drew fresh shafts from their bundles and continued shooting. There was no pause, no respite, just the mechanical rhythm of professional killers plying their trade. Draw, aim, loose, reach for another arrow. 6 shots per minute per archer, multiplied by thousands of bowmen. The second wave of French attackers, dismounted men-at-arms, who should have learned from their mounted comrades' fate, pressed forward into the same killing ground. These were experienced warriors, veterans of previous campaigns, who understood battlefield tactics. Yet they too found themselves helpless against the combination of English archery and Norman mud. As they struggled across the field, their heavy armor became a liability rather than protection. Each step required enormous effort, and the constant rain of arrows meant that stopping to rest was tantamount to suicide. Men who reached the English line arrived exhausted and disorganized, easy prey for English soldiers who had conserved their strength behind their defensive positions. Henry himself was in the thick of the fighting when the French finally reached his position. Contemporary accounts describe him taking a massive blow to his helmet from a French battle axe, an impact so severe that it knocked one of the jewels from his crown. For a moment, it seemed the English king might fall, victim to the very violence he had courted, but a Welsh member of his bodyguard, Dafydd Gam, threw himself into the fray and saved his monarch's life at the cost of his own. This moment of personal combat embodied everything that made Henry such an effective leader. He didn't command from a safe distance or delegate the dangerous work to subordinates. He fought alongside his men, shared their risks, and demonstrated through his actions that no sacrifice was too great for victory. When his soldiers saw their king's helmet dented and bloodied but still fighting, they found reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed. The French assault began to collapse under its own weight. Knights who had charged forward with visions of glory found themselves trapped in a press of bodies where movement was impossible, and death came from all directions. Those who fell could not rise again, their armor too heavy and the mud too deep. Others were simply trampled by their own comrades as panic spread through the ranks. The English archers, having emptied their quivers, abandoned their bows and drew swords and mallets. They swarmed over the fallen French knights like scavengers, finishing off the wounded and stripping armor from the dead. Many French nobles who might have surrendered for ransom found themselves butchered in the mud by common soldiers who cared nothing for the conventions of chivalric warfare. It was during this phase of the battle that Henry made one of the most controversial decisions of his military career. Convinced that a French counterattack was imminent, and worried that the hundreds of prisoners his men had taken might turn against their captors, he ordered the execution of all French captives except for a few of the highest nobility. The slaughter that followed was systematic and brutal. Contemporary accounts describe groups of prisoners herded into buildings that were then set ablaze. Others were simply cut down where they stood, their pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. Modern historians estimate that as many as 2,200 Frenchmen may have died in this massacre, a number that dwarfed the combat casualties on the English side. This decision has stained Henry's reputation for centuries, with many labeling it an early example of a war crime. Yet contemporary sources, even French chroniclers, rarely criticized the English king for his actions. In the context of medieval warfare, where the rules of chivalry applied only to those who could afford them, the execution of prisoners was not uncommon when military necessity demanded it. The Battle of Agincourt lasted less than 3 hours, but its effects would ripple through European history for generations. When the fighting finally ended and the mud settled, the casualty figures told a story so one-sided that many refused to believe them. French losses numbered in the thousands, with estimates ranging from 6,000 to 10,000 dead. English casualties were counted in the hundreds, possibly as few as 25 killed in action. Among the French dead lay the flower of their nobility. The Dukes of Alençon and Bar had perished alongside countless counts, barons, and knights whose families had ruled their domains for centuries. An entire generation of French military leadership had been wiped out in a single afternoon, leaving gaping holes in the kingdom's political and military structure that would take decades to fill. The prisoners taken alive were almost as valuable as the dead were costly. The Duke of Orleans, the Count of Eu, and dozens of other high-ranking nobles would spend years in English captivity, their ransom payments flowing into Henry's treasury to fund future campaigns. The wealth extracted from these captives would finance English military operations for years to come. But beyond the immediate tactical victory lay implications that would reshape the very nature of European warfare. Agincourt proved definitively that the age of heavy cavalry dominance was ending, that common soldiers armed with the right weapons and fighting on favorable ground could destroy the mightiest knights in Christendom. The psychological impact was even greater than the military one, shattering French confidence while elevating English morale to unprecedented heights. News of the victory spread across Europe like wildfire, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and diplomats who could barely believe what they were reporting. The impossible had happened. A ragged band of English survivors had not merely defeated the greatest army in Europe, They had annihilated it so completely that France would require years to recover. Henry's march to Calais after the battle became a triumphal procession through territory that had witnessed one of history's most stunning reversals of fortune. French towns that had expected to celebrate English defeat instead watched in stunned silence as the victorious army passed through their streets. The political landscape of northern France had been transformed overnight, and everyone knew that the old certainties no longer applied. And so, on that October afternoon in 1415, the impossible became reality. The muddy fields of Agincourt had witnessed more than just a military victory. They had seen the death of an age, the end of a world where birth and breeding mattered more than innovation and determination. Henry's exhausted soldiers had not only survived against overwhelming odds, they had rewritten the rules of warfare itself and humbled the greatest kingdom in Europe. The longbow had proven mightier than the lance. English discipline had triumphed over French arrogance, and a young king's desperate gamble had transformed into one of history's most legendary victories. But perhaps most importantly, Agincourt showed that, in the crucible of battle, courage and cunning could overcome any advantage that numbers or tradition might provide. The echoes of that extraordinary day would resonate for centuries, inspiring countless tales of underdogs facing impossible odds and emerging victorious. Because sometimes, just sometimes, David really does slay Goliath, and the course of history turns on the courage of those who refuse to accept defeat. The Battle of Agincourt stands as eternal proof that the greatest victories often come not from strength, but from the unshakable belief that some causes are worth any sacrifice.